Hey there, today we're diving into the fascinating world of mind, health, and everything in between, all wrapped up in a lighthearted journey through some intriguing concepts. First up, let's talk about the difference between what's happening on the surface and what's lurking beneath, like how some test items show differential item functioning, meaning they might work differently for different folks, depending on their background and experiences. Speaking of the mind and self-efficacy, there's an awesome sense of I got this, which can really influence how we handle life's challenges. Now, when researchers look into traits there aren't immediately visible, they often talk about latent trait estimates. Think of them as the hidden layers behind personality or ability scores. But sometimes mental health gets complicated. Enter psychopathology, which is like trying to understand the messy tangled knots in our mental wiring. These knots can be influenced by physiological factors, our body's own biological processes, and mental processes, which include everything from how we think to how we feel. All of this exists within an ecological context of environment exposure to stressors, and even exposome, which is a fancy term for all the environmental exposures we encounter over a lifetime. These factors can trigger epigenetic dynamics. Think of them as tiny switches on our DNA that turn genes on or off without changing the sequence itself. For example, DNA methylation is one such switch, affecting how our genes are expressed, especially under stress. Speaking of stress, it's managed by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, a fancy way of describing our body's stress response system. When stress hits, our bodies release cortisol and glucocorticoids, which help us respond to challenges, but too much stress exposure can make our glucocorticoid receptor sensitivity change, affecting how we handle future stress. Variations in the glucocorticoid receptor gene, including GR polymorphisms, can influence the sensitivity and even modify receptor activation and binding protein levels, kind of like tweaking the volume on our stress response. On the genetic front, our DNA and genetic variation shapes many aspects of our health, including how our brain structures develop. For instance, genotype-dependent structural differences can influence the size and function of areas like the cortical surface area and cortical thickness, especially in the frontal parietal temporal regions. These regions are the command centers for cognition, language processing, and social judgment. Language itself is a marvel covering phonetic, phonological, lexical, and syntactic aspects, building some semantic networks that help us communicate our thoughts and feelings, our self-awareness, and internal monitoring, while heavy on brain regions like the insula and precuneus, which help us reflect inward and stay aware of ourselves. When it comes to recognizing objects or understanding social cues, parts of the brain like the fusiform gyrus, superior temporal gyrus, and inferior parietal lobe will come into play. In conditions like schizophrenia, psychosis, or PTSD, the brain circuitry such as hippocampal frontal circuits can get disrupted, leading to reality disorientations or distorted perceptions. This is where cognition and mental process of acquiring knowledge in the neocortex, our brain's outer layer, become critical. Finally, the structure of the brain itself, like cortical surface area and thickness, varies across individuals. And that's a quick tour through the amazing, intricate universe inside our heads, reminding us just how wonderfully complex and adaptable we really are.